The final Coast Guard report has been released. It's been over 9 months since the hearings were completed. The report is 327 pages long and is interesting and comprehensive. It's not just a summary of the hearings, but there is some new information from interviews done by the board privately. However, it does not answer every question. It's also different and better than the information presented in the Discovery and Netflix movies. Those movies spent too much time on the drama of the Bahamas testing, which had no bearing on the implosion. Since I have done 12 detailed Titan videos and wrote a book about the disaster, I am well versed in the details. I could do all those things ahead of the report because the public hearings and the documents were so comprehensive. In this video, I will tell you when something is new, meaning it wasn't in the public hearings or documents, or when something gave me much more clarity on an issue. After some introductory information, the report actually starts by discussing the end of Titan, Dive 88. So let's do that first. In this video, we will cover how they summarized Dive 88 and see if we can learn anything new. It starts under the heading Findings of Fact, Section 4.1, called The Incident. It starts by defining what an expedition is. The 2023 Titanic expedition was advertised as 5 separate missions, each lasting approximately 8 to 10 days. Passengers were provided with the opportunity to act as mission specialists whose training and fees supported the missions. Note that through the hearings and the report, sometimes dives are discussed in terms of the mission number, and sometimes they are discussed by the dive number that happened during a mission. So work needs to be done to correlate them. I'll give an example later. They have a figure that presents a site map and reviews the dives. In the 2 previous Titanic expeditions, a total of 33 dives, 13 of which made it to the depth of the Titanic on the ocean floor. But they don't specify the number of dives that actually saw the wreck. Here is one of my modified charts that shows the dives through the years. If the dive history of Hole 1 and Hole 2 interest you, I have a video dedicated to the dive numbers that makes it clear. They mentioned early on that Titan was built in Washington, and it is undocumented, unregistered, non-certificated, and unclassed. They then go on to describe it, but we know all those basic details. It also has a section describing the polar prints and a section describing the LARs. It then goes on to present the 2023 missions. The first 4 missions, 1 through 4, could not be attempts to get to the Titanic. Dive 84 was a test dive, and then there was bad weather and other issues, so dives 85, 86, and 87 never got off the LARs.
Stockton was getting very, very frustrated that he had not been able to get a successful dive in
The
and
entire season.
the entire season.
They have this chart in the report, but at this point they don't clarify that this includes 2 important dives. Mission 3 was Dive 86, in which the YouTuber Jake Kohler had a dive attempt, which was not over the Titanic, but got aborted. His video about the experience got 11 million views. Mission 4, which is Dive 87, is the Kroiman couple dive, which was a complete disaster during the aborted attempt. This dive could very well have contributed to damage that caused Dive 88 to fail. I have a video just on Dive 87 with details and graphics to explain what happened. Later in the report, the potential for damage from this dive is discussed. This is information which I do not believe was released in the hearings. The crew on Dive 88 paid different amounts. I'm assuming that the Dawoods paid $250,000 each, and Harding paid only $150,000. That seemed to be typical for Stockton. Pricing was variable and negotiated. He gave deals to those who he thought would be good promoters of the expeditions. Then several pages are devoted to Polar Prince maritime stuff, weather, and the OceanGate daily plans. The next interesting thing is showing the risk index for Dive 88. It is unclear what benefit this had. The MBI was neither provided nor able to locate any OceanGate documentation assigning a risk classification corresponding to the calculated risk index number. The significance of a risk index value of 35 remains unknown. An OceanGate employee said the risk index scoring was determined by Mr. Rush, the mission director, and possibly the pilot on the mission. This is emphasized again in Section 5 of the report. Also, former OceanGate employees and others interviewed were unaware of how the risk index was calculated and left the assessments completely up to Mr. Rush. This lack of clarity and consistent application of the risk assessment system made it completely ineffective. Witness Antonella Wilby had a great quote about this.
Based on the other outfits I've worked with and, my experience in this industry, I saw what I would classify as safety theater.
The report then has several pages that outline the procedures the OceanGate staff does to get ready to launch. So the next interesting thing in the report is carefully assessing the communication system OceanGate relied on. The Polar Prince was fitted with an EvoLogix hydroacoustic modem with USBL, selected by OceanGate as Titan's sole communications equipment capable of subsurface communications. The installed system used abbreviated text fields to communicate between the Polar Prince and the Titan. The Titan was not fitted with a voice communications system capable of communicating while the submersible was operating below the surface. They chose not to use the more modern systems and better ways to communicate. This is their communication cheat sheet. Since the bandwidth is so low with this modem system, they have to use short codes. If they want to actually write something out, it had to be limited to a few words. There are apparently better systems. There were numerous times in the past where communication was lost with the sub for extended periods of time. The acoustic modems operate by encoding data into sound signals, which are transmitted through the water and received by surface or underwater receivers. There are limitations in terms of bandwidth. They are susceptible to interference from ambient noise. The data rate is typically low, which restricts the type of information that can be sent. So on both ends, the pings then have to get received, converted back into letters or words, and then processed to be shown on a computer screen. So besides the low data rate, there's a fair amount of processing to be done. At this point, the report prints out some of the short messages exchanged with the sub during the descent. But this is a good time to skip ahead in the report where they provide more details about the system. This was not discussed in the hearings. The Synapse software makes it possible to exchange short text messages between them during positioning. There's a chat widget in the right side panel. The maximum text message size is 64 bytes, which is typically equivalent to 64 characters or roughly 10 to 13 words. OceanGate relied on the chat widget's limited messaging capability to serve as their sole source of communications. Limitations created by the chat widget hindered communications. This occasionally led to frustration and miscommunications between the Titan's operator and the communications and tracking team. The report expands on the problem with a contractor interview familiar with the system. Normally, there would be two devices. Communications, which is completely separate from your tracking. This is the first case I've ever seen where it is all done on the same thing. When one failed, so did the other, so both tracking and communications were down. Even later in the report, in Section 5.18, the Coast Guard comes right out and calls this a cost-cutting measure. OceanGate's financial pressures were also likely behind a critical shortcut OceanGate implemented when they incorporated Titan's text communications into the existing tracking capability. This resulted in Titan having to rely on limited text-based communication system, rather than the industry standard for submersibles, which enables voice communications. Voice communication systems, long established in subsea operations, offer real-time clarity, nuanced context, and collaborative problem-solving capabilities. And even worse, the Coast Guard throws in a little conspiracy theory, thinking that Stockton did not want voice communications because he did not want audible announcements about all the problems that were always occurring. He wanted to control the messaging at all times. This text system kept it quiet and private. The CEO dismissed voice communication as a distraction and preferred text-based systems to maintain control over Titan's operations. However, this decision centralized authority at the expense of collaborative safety. The next thing in the report helped me understand something about the navigation to the Titanic. This is an interesting exchange, and it demonstrates the choppy text message system. Titan texted the Polar Prince, "Are you at the bow?" They sent a follow-up message about the strength of their signal. Polar Prince responded, "Polar Prince not at the bow, making our way there." Titan responded with an A. This is so interesting. Titan's intended operational plan was to track off the position of the surface asset. The Polar Prince would attempt to station itself above the bow of the Titanic. Titan would navigate to their position and then use sonar to locate the wreck of the Titanic. This is a good time for an aside and to discuss how hard it is to find the wreck and some rules that P.H. Nargeolet would be aware of and he would violate on Dive 80. First, when they launched the Titan, it takes over 2 hours to free fall to the bottom, so they have to consider currents and drifting for the release point, so they don't drop directly over the wreck. It's quite challenging. The second thing is that there are international rules governing the Titanic site. NOAA oversees the site. This is based on the RMS Titanic Maritime Memorial Act of 1986. This was expanded by Section 113 of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2017. It prohibits research, exploration, salvage, or any other activity that would physically alter or disturb the Titanic wreck or wreck site. Since OceanGate told NOAA they would only be scanning and not touching, OceanGate did not need Section 133 authorization. But this is what was in the letter from NOAA to OceanGate. They needed to maintain the submersible and all its subsystems, weights, drop weights, skids, a sufficient distance from the wreck so as to avoid coming into contact with it on all dives or attempted dives in either normal or emergency operation modes. They could not drop or deposit intentionally or unintentionally any weights or equipment such that they would land on or near the wreck. So you land on the bottom away from the wreck, and then you have to find it in total darkness by sonar first. This is why navigation based on the surface ship and communication with the surface ship was not something to cut costs on. We will talk about pH, Stockton, the 133 rules, and Dive 80 in another video. So now we will continue with Dive 88 and the implosion and see why I wanted to explain the modem. It has an impact again. The first evidence of the implosion is when Wendy Rush hears the bang at the communication desk.
It's just the transceiver head moves around.
400 meters to go.
Yeah. It should be about 500 meters, 30. What was that bang?
The speed of sound through water is about 1,500 meters per second. So at the Titan's depth, when Wendy hears the bang, the Titan imploded about 2.2 seconds before. But then a text message from the Titan pops up on her computer, drop 2 weights. That's 16 seconds after she hears the bang.
500 meters, 30. What was that bang? Drop 2 weights. Titan dropped 2 weights.
This delay is due to the slow bandwidth and the processing time of the modem system.
Drop 2 weights.
Then, about 106 seconds later, they realize they've lost all tracking.
Ready to transfer to the sub.
Roger that. Thank you for confirming.
We've lost tracking.
Can you confirm how many bricks are on the platform currently?
New information in the report that was not in the hearings was that the MBI interviewed the master of the Polar Prince about the bang, and he said this: With the benefit of hindsight, I now believe I felt the Polar Prince shudder around the time communications were reportedly lost. But at the time, we thought nothing of it. It was slight. Now, of course, this delay makes no difference at the tragic end of Dive 88, but this tolerance of poor communication and tracking for all 3 expedition seasons shows a level of unprofessionalism. After the communications loss, OceanGate started their protocol, which was written in their manual as a 15-minute, 30-minute, and 45-minute comms check. But actually, they were frantically trying to contact the Titan. And their protocol was to predict the surfacing time, assuming Titan was attempting an emergency surface, and then do their own grid pattern search for 3 hours before notifying outside emergency personnel. They calculated that an emergency ascent would have the Titan floating on the surface by 3 p.m. Since OceanGate went through their protocols, it was not until Sunday evening at 7:10 p.m. that they made their first call to the Canadian Coast Guard, who referred them to the U.S. Coast Guard. This was now over 7 hours from the last communication. While air searches began, OceanGate contacted the U.S. Air Force for emergency transportation of the Odysseus ROV to Newfoundland. This ROV can reach 6,000 meters. The Horizon Arctic had to quickly be modified to deploy the Odysseus. Over the course of the next few days, 11 vessels and 4 aircraft were used to search 12,145 square miles. The search grid was massive. The report also describes 2 incomprehensible things about the search and rescue effort. OceanGate did not reach out to any deep water ROV assets to warn them about their deep diving mission in that region, nor did they notify the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard reports the added hindrance of OceanGate's decision not to confirm any backup deepwater assets or voluntarily report their dive operations as recommended by the U.S. Coast Guard National Search and Recovery Plan. For disabling events that occurred at depths beyond those accessible by divers, the OceanGate HSE manual stated that OceanGate had contracts at Oceaneering and Phoenix International that had ROVs capable of reaching depths of 4,000 meters. However, the MBI confirmed with Oceaneering and Phoenix International that OceanGate did not notify them of their plans for the 2023 Titanic expedition, and there were no contracts in place to have emergency deep-sea rescue resources on standby for OceanGate. Think about that. With all the problems Titan had during the previous 2 seasons, in 2023, they were out there in the North Atlantic diving, and they didn't notify anyone. The second crazy thing is, despite OceanGate calling for help, this is what the Coast Guard reported first occurred. Prior to launching the C-130, the Coast Guard's first attempt to coordinate search and rescue efforts were directed to the Polar Prince. However, the Polar Prince told the Coast Guard they were taking their tasking from OceanGate's mission director and were not going to do any active searching directed by the U.S. Coast Guard. On Thursday morning, June 22nd, the Titan debris field was found on the ocean floor, confirming the implosion. At this point, the report uses several pages to explain why the Coast Guard had jurisdiction and defining what a passenger vessel is. It also spends many pages discussing classing of submersibles and outlining OceanGate's excuses, but we don't need to cover that here. We need to skip ahead to Section 5, the analysis, and see if this report defines a root cause for the implosion. And it leaves open 2 possible culprits: loss of hull integrity or the glue joint of the pressure hull. The investigation by Don Kramer of the NTSB forms the basis for the conclusions, and his final report is more definitive than his testimony. He writes about Dive 80. The initial delamination of the carbon fiber likely occurred after surfacing from Dive 80. The material strength of the carbon fiber was significantly compromised post-delamination. He then writes about the 5-inch thick hull. During the Titan's design phase, strength calculations assumed an intact 5-inch thick carbon fiber hull with fully bonded layers. I talked about that extensively in my video on the co-bonded hull, where I said that all 5 layers had to behave as one. And in this report, which is more definitive than his testimony, he points to buckling as the initiating event. As a result, a full material failure in the form of buckling became far more likely post-delamination. So this means the hull toward the front end was weakened by the inner layer delamination, porosity in the laminate, gaps in the co-bonded film layers, and random weakness caused by grind spots. A section of the hull moves inward, causing out-of-roundness, which is a problem with a cylinder under uniform pressure, as Roy Thomas from APS testified about in the hearings. So this area becomes the initial area of collapse. But the NTSB also writes about the epoxy bonding as the failure point. There was no comprehensive testing effort to validate long-term performance under the specific conditions. A full understanding of the adhesive behavior over time was lacking. Examination of the recovered Titan debris revealed that the adhesive used to bond the hull to the titanium segments had disbonded from the entire forward segment. The adhesive was mostly disbonded from the aft segment. And this brings us to the end of the report, Section 6, the conclusions. The initiating event for this casualty was the loss of the structural integrity of the Titan pressure vessel. The probable failure point of the hull was either the adhesive joint between the Titan's forward dome and the titanium segment, or the carbon fiber hole near the forward end of the Titan. So that is my summary as well as I can do it, working with the way the Coast Guard presented Dive 88 in the final report, and then adding some things to give it better perspective. If you watch this to the end and you like this content, then you should consider watching all the videos in my Titan playlist. I link to some in the description. If the Titan story really interests you, you should consider getting my book, which is a document that adds a lot to the final report. The digital formats are inexpensive. An amazing keepsake about this saga would be the paperback version of my book, available on Amazon. I have a link to the book webpage in the description. The site is www.titandives.com. Thanks for your time and support. I have more videos to do about the final Coast Guard report.